Aloha, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the Workforce Development Council Economic Trends webinar. We're very happy that you're here. Let me just frame the conversation a little bit and by saying that, so I think as we all recognize, Hawaii's economy is shifting. There's developments in the national arena that's happening that may impact our local ecosystem. So the choices we make today will really allow us to shape how prosperous our communities will be tomorrow. So this event, as mentioned, is sponsored by the Workforce Development Council, which is an attached agency to the Department of Labor and Industrial Relations. So for those of you who may not be as familiar, WDC is a 41-member council composed of representatives from the private sector, labor organizations, and relevant public sector agencies. So I just wanted to have a quick, again, overview of uh, WDC before I turn it over to our esteemed speaker. Hang on a second. For those of you who may not be as familiar, so okay, so here is the functions of WDC as mandated by the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So we're a policy advisor to the governor. This is a federally mandated role. And as such, we are spearheading the development and the implementation of the Workforce Unified State Unified Plan. We're also the convener of bringing together all the various stakeholders in this arena to focus on workforce issues. We can be a workforce analyst by developing, disseminating, understanding economic trends, and that's the reason why we're here this afternoon. We are also mandated to be a broker, trying to solve common problems, a community voice, and last but not least, a capacity builder. So this afternoon, I think we are touching a little bit on many of those aspects, but particularly number 3. And so we're trying to facilitate a conversation so we can make sure that there's alignment between workforce development and also economic development. So this afternoon, we're very privileged to have with us somebody who has spent a lot of time looking at data, analyzing data, and like a doctor, coming out with a diagnosis on our economy. So Dr. Seth Colby holds a PhD in international relations and has worked in economic development at such prestigious organizations like the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and the Johns Hopkins University. So Seth also teaches economics at UH Scheidler's College of Business. His research highlights Hawaii's tax burden and its effect on the cost of living. So he is currently the Tax Research and Planning Officer at the Hawaii Department of Taxation, overseeing revenue forecast, policy analysis, and legislative impact assessment. So as we promised, this is just going to be another forecast. It's really a conversation about what's next and the decisions that can make a difference in our future. So Dr. Colby, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Sure. All right, aloha, everybody. My name is Seth Colby, for just to bear repeating one more time over. I do work at the Department of Taxation, and I manage a research group, right? So within the Department of Taxation, we have a research group of a number of economists that we analyze legislation, work with our decision makers, our leaders in the legislature, in the governor's office, to help them formulate and write into law good tax policy and good economic policy in general. So a lot of what we spend time doing is talking to people, trying to understand what they do and what they want to do with a given law. And then we provide the economic analysis, because one of the things that's like really unique, maybe it's not unique, but it is a comparative advantage of economics. It helps you understand trade-offs, right? So oftentimes we want to do one thing, and so we create a law to do that. But economics is very good at articulating, measuring, and showing where unintended consequences come from. So the second and third order payoffs or consequences of our decisions. So that's what we do on a daily basis. And one of the things that we are also trying to do is help people understand how our economy works and how the decisions that we make collectively influence the economic future of Hawaii. So I I'm going to talk in just three general segments. So the first part of this presentation is the basics of our economy. A lot of people have a general understanding of it, but I really want to make sure that we're all on the same page with it. Then I'm going to go into economic trends of the last several decades and where we're at and why we're there, perhaps. And then third of all, I want to talk about different ways of reversing those trends or influencing those trends the if the state and its decision makers and its people so desire. So without further ado, um, when I begin on giving my talks on the economy, because I'm often invited to give talks, I often begin with just this map, right? And this map is just shows where Hawaii is relative to the rest of the United States and rest of the world, really. And I'm going to argue that this map actually explains half of our economy, no problem at all. And the reason for this is it explains two things. One is now, as I'm sure most of you understand, is Hawaii is in a very favorable climate, right? So you got the trade winds coming around uh, and smacking right over the top of Hawaii. So not only are we a tropical climate, but we're a temperate tropical climate, right? And so we probably have some of the nicest weather in the world that attracts people. We also have beautiful island climates. And and not only that, our location right here is right below the Alaska and the Bering Strait, where all the big swells and storms come from, and that's why one of the reasons why we're a preeminent area for surfing. And not only did the Hawaiian culture birth the surf industry, we now have like the 5 Mile Miracle on top, and all those are really like play a big part in terms of tourism and why we attract people here. The other reason is what you'll notice is there is only one island chain in the Northern Pacific of any potential size, and that is Hawaii. And that means that this is a very important geostrategic location in the whole entire world. You have a lot of the world's leading, you know, massive players, political players. You got China, Japan, you got the Russia, Indonesia, you got all of South America down there. And so, you know, one of the reasons why Hawaii has like a high level of development is it's always been a important strategic military asset, right? And so with that, tourism is 23% of our economy, and then just federal government and military is another 18.9%. That is much larger than the average US state, where it's 4%, right? So if you understand those two things, you understand Hawaii's economy essentially. And most of the other industries that are there are supporting those industries indirectly. So it's really geography is what drives our economy. Um, this is just another way of saying that, like, it's no surprise that most of our growth still occurs in these two industries. So these are the change in the contributions of our economic output, real GDP, between 2001 and 2019 of different industries. The top one you will see is real estate, rental, and leasing. For a bunch of accounting reasons, economic accounting reasons, this is always going to be the largest, right? And this represents basically the increasing price of real estate within our economy, but it's not really a job creator. The other two things that you want to mention is government and government enterprises does increase a lot of our represent a lot of our wage or our economic output, increase in economic output. Healthcare, which is something that you see everywhere else in the United States, healthcare costs and has just risen disproportionately relative to our economy over the last 30 years. And then you see the things that are associated with tourism, right? Which is the retail trade, accommodation, and food services, things like that. So as much as we want to get out of this reliance on these two industries, they still represent really important parts of our industry, and we should let a big part of our decision-making framework is, are we going to accept that? Are we going to resist that? And if we want to diversify, what is the best way to diversify from that? So another thing that I think is very important to highlight is we often get here in Hawaii, we get very frustrated with the cost of living, with low economic growth, with low prospects. But it's really important to understand that Hawaii is really the wealthiest island chain in the world, right? There are some other islands, perhaps off of Europe, that are tax havens, that are just home to a couple really rich people. But for places with large population centers, Hawaii economically, hands down, performs just about any other island in the world. And the reason for that is islands are hard places to have economies, right? They're usually far from big economic centers, shipping, energy, all these food, all these things are big issues. And we are the most isolated island chain in the world, right? So actually, Hawaii does very well for a Hawaii, an island. So these are some comparisons of I picked out, but it goes down the list. So I picked out Hawaii, which is part of the United States, the Canary Islands, which is part of Spain, the Azores, which is part of Portugal, and then you got Fiji and New Zealand. So a couple things I wanted to point out. One is our GDP per capita is much higher than just any other place, right? So the amount of resources that we have at our disposal to confront our problems and make challenges and live our lives is much higher than other island chains. The other thing I want to point out is as much as we're worried about tourism as GDP, tourism as a part of our GDP is actually low compared to a lot of other island chains, right? So we have it, for us, it's about 22%, for the Canary Islands, 32, 28, Fiji's 39. If I were to pick some Caribbean islands, which tend to be much poorer than us, they have a much higher dependency on tourism. So small economies tend to specialize in one industry. In the case of Hawaii, we specialize in two industries, right? We specialize in military and kind of government being a strategic asset for the federal government, and also we focus on tourism, right? So there are other possibilities. We're going to talk about that and think about different ways of spawning that, because it is important. We want a diversified economy, but it is also really important to understand that in terms of economics, geographical realities, it's very difficult for small islands to diversify a lot, right? You think of places, we often compare ourselves to like California and New York, but these are massive land areas with huge like universities, lots of different people, right? So it is important when we are thinking about how we want to set the economic trajectory of our state that we understand our underlying endowments, our strengths, and sometimes our limitations and challenges, which are often geographic. The other thing I wanted to point out is, often we compare ourselves to New Zealand. New Zealand's always like a really nice case uh, for to compare ourselves to. It's kind of an island, but one of the things that is very different from New Zealand is it just has so much land compared to its people, right? So in the population density of Hawaii is 86. This is the number of inhabitants per square kilometer. In New Zealand, it's 20, right? So New Zealand has lower tourism to GDP ratio, but it's a primarily agricultural society. And but still, Hawaii is almost has twice as much wealth per capita as New Zealand, right? So even though they have a more diversified economy, they're still not as well off in economic terms, which I'm always putting in caveats, right? Like welfare and human flourishing does not only depend on economics, but that's what I'm here talking about. But it is important to understand that Hawaii is in a really unique and privileged position. And when we think about our challenges and where we want to go, that's something to think about. I'll just show down here in GDP per capita compared to the mainlands, right? So even islands, island states or island portions of a country tend to be much poorer than the mainland alternative. Hawaii is 92%, like the GDP per capita in Hawaii is 92% of that of the rest of the United States. But in the Canary Islands, it's much lower. It's 78%, 83%. Okinawa, another place that has a lot of the attributes of Hawaii, which is dependent on military bases and also is a tourism economy, is also much lower, right? And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but Hawaii's used to have a GDP per capita higher than the rest of the United States for most of the time. So that's the backdrop, right? So when you think about the economy and understanding the economy, at least through the lens that I use, I always think in terms of geography is really important for where we are. It's part of our endowments, part of our comparative advantage, and probably one of the things that if we're going to leverage different aspects uh, of our comparative advantage, something geographic will usually be involved there. The other thing is we're pretty well off, right? We're doing very well as an island chain, and to think about that as well. So let's talk about economic trends. So before we start off with a bunch of surfers in Waikiki learning how to surf, the basics, this is like also in the South Shore when they had the big swells a couple years ago, but this is an outrigger canoe and they're about to fall off. So the reason I put that video that photo there is I want to show you where Hawaii was in the 1980s and 1990s where we are now. So on the left-hand side, what you'll see is a GDP per capita in Hawaii in the blue line. And the orange line or the red dash line is the continental US, or the rest of the United States. So what you'll see is the United States or Hawaii in the early 1980s and even to the 1990s was doing much better as an overall portion relative to the United States. Now, this does not count for the cost of living, but it does show its relative performance. And then over time, incidentally, just to point things out, 1990 was the last year that Hawaii built a large hotel. So then it started flattening it out, and then we've been going about the same with the rest of the United States. And then lately, over the last 10, 15 years, we've been diverging and underperforming, right? So you can think of Hawaii as doing very well, coming out of statehood with a lot of the things. And this is, of course, this is economics. There are environmental, social concerns that we have to think about, right? And part of the corrections where a lot of the decisions made in the 1980s, but we're talking about economics here, and that's what we're measuring. So you can think of Hawaii, if you look here at the graph right here, in the 1980s, we were about 16% higher than the national average, and now we're about 5% lower than the national average, right? So there's just been a gradual decline and a gradual stagnation in our economy over the last 4 decades. And anytime you want to understand Hawaii, reversing these trends, you have to look at this, right? Like a lot has happened over the last 4 decades because of big decisions that we made here locally. This is another graph that shows you, but this is kind of the same idea, but in a much shorter time frame. So this is by Paul Brubaker. I think he spoke to you last time, but he'll show you, so you may have seen this, but the bottom line is, this is real GDP, so it's slightly different data. It was indexed to a slightly different year, but it tells us essentially the same story, like, right? Which is Hawaii was doing a little better, but after coming into COVID and coming out of COVID, we lost our gains and we haven't improved. And this is one of the big fundamental questions, right? So a couple of things that are happening in Hawaii is we had the strict COVID shutdown, right? The strictest in the country, and that did a one-off, and we were never really able to pivot back from that. Part of that, we've had out net migration, at least domestically. And there's been, because people are really fed up with tourism, right? And so we've really haven't embraced tourism like we have in the past. And one of the big question marks that we have to decide as a state is how do we take this industry where people want to come from all around the world and leave thousands of dollars with us, but also make that compatible with how we want to live as a state, right? That's not an easy question, but our decisions are being reflected in this data. Here's another example that people are choosing to leave the state, right? And so this is index, so the numbers start around the same time, but it shows the changes in population for the United States as a whole and changes in Hawaii's population. And so what you'll see is, in the last slide, we had a little bit of growth over here. And so our population was growing a little bit more. And our population growth is very linked to our economic performance. When our economic performance outperforms the rest of the United States, we tend to grow as an economy. When it underperforms, people trying to move away. And the people who tend to move away tend to be young people right when they get out of college, people who are forming families, and where they're deciding to stay. This is not only when you lose people at the beginning of their career, they tend not to come back. And so you can think of all a person's career earnings, and usually in your 20s, make a lot of money, but somehow, this is my experience with a lot of people I know, it just works out, right? And you get a job, you get to have a family, you start earning more, and your earning potential goes way up, and it peaks around the 40s and 50s for each individual. And when people move away in their 20s, we lose the 40 and 50 the peak for a lot of these 40 and 50-year-olds, right? So this is an important consideration. And then you have to throw on top of this, and this is something that's been with Hawaii for a long time, but it's been exacerbated and it's more acute now than ever, is our high cost of living, right? So there's a number of different cost of living indexes, but in every single index, every single ranking, Hawaii comes out as the most expensive place to live in the country, right? So you can think as our income was declining in the first place, but when you put on top of it the high cost of living, it becomes even more problematic, right? And you can see all of these places with high cost of living, Hawaii, Massachusetts, California, all these states are losing population. They're going to low cost of living stage, which the big ones are Florida, Texas, Nevada, right? And so these are where people are moving, because even though people love where they live, they're making economic decisions, and the cost of living is really important for people, right? This is another graph that I want to show that I think is very important and underappreciated. So this is the labor force participation rate. This is the number of people working or actively looking for work as a percentage of their population. So again, what I'm looking at is the last 4 decades of trends, because that's where I think you have to understand the Hawaii economy. In the 1980s and 1990s, we had a higher labor force participation. And now it changed that in the 1990s, and now we're going lower and lower. In fact, we have the 38th lowest labor participation rate in the country. That means fewer workers are sustaining our population, and that is a problem, right? It's dynamism, it makes it harder for tax collection, all these issues, right? And it also speaks to the lack of opportunity here in the state. So on top of that, I had mentioned that we are dependent on two things. One is tourism, but the other thing is the military and federal spending, right? Because of our unique location, you can do things here, you can project power, you can do research. We're a really unique spot, right? And Hawaii has actually, since the days of Senator Inouye, been very good at getting using federal spending to augment and support the local economy. I The thing is, the federal spending is they're coming for a reckoning, and this was irrespective of whoever got elected into the White House. The fact is, our federal deficits are ballooning into, in some ways, very unsustainable. So, the top right-hand side, you'll see in this red line is the net interest payments as a percentage of all of our spending. So, last year, it surpassed what we spend on paying back people loans, like the interest on the loans that we owe people, surpassed all defense spending, right? And then it's even going to surpass what we spend on Medicare. So the federal government, it has to make some very tough decisions in the next several years. It seems like the current administration is accelerating this problem, right, and bringing this forward. But the amount of money that the U.S. has to spend is going to decrease, right? So it has two options. It can either raise taxes or it can cut spending, right? And usually it's going to involve one of the two. You'll also see that this is the federal debt as a percentage of GDP at the very bottom of this graph. And what you see, it increased during the Great Recession, and then it really spiked up during the federal debt, but this is 120%, right? So our federal debt has never been this high other than World War II when we were engaged in a all-out war, right? So these are big questions that we should at least keep in mind because that will influence the economic environment that Hawaii has to compete in. So just as a reminder, Hawaii has gone from being a high income state to a slightly below average over the last 40 years. Hawaii was one of the worst economic reformers coming out of COVID and has yet to recover. Hawaii's high cost of living exacerbates the problem of declining income. People are leaving the state, especially those beginning at the beginning of their career where they're with the highest income potential. Fewer people are working and contributing to the economy. And due to fiscal pressures at the federal level, transfers to Hawaii are likely to decline in the future, right? So this is a tough environment, but keeping up with the surfing metaphor, the whole point of all of this is there are conditions out there, but we can maneuver things to the best of our ability. And what we need to do as a state is make tough decisions, or we are going to make decisions no matter what, right? The idea is we want to make informed decisions so we can create a future that we collectively articulate and want, and we can understand the trade-offs, right? Because we're not going to get everything that we want going forward. So this is a workforce development council, right? So one of the things that is central to all of this is a living wage. And people have been very upset that like you need a living wage to live here in Hawaii, and that living wage keeps going up and up and up, right? So it's important to think about how we conceptualize a living wage. A living wage is the amount of income you need for a basic cost, a cost of basket of goods and services that are essential, right? And oftentimes, when we think about living wage and we think about the living wage problem, we immediately think, oh, we just need to increase incomes. The problem is we've been doing that, and this is a very effective approach. I'm not saying either or. I'm just saying that we have to consider the numerator as well as the denominator. A lot of our problems have been focusing on the denominator, which is increasing incomes. That is leaking out and actually increasing the cost of goods, right? So it's the cost of living that is driving up the living wage much more, or driving down the living wage, I should say, much more than changes in income. And Hawaii has an income paradox, right? So We rank the 11th highest weekly wage in the country, but when you take into effect cost of living, it plummets to 43. So employers face this thing where they have to pay relatively high salaries, but the people who the workers feel like they're getting gypped and they're feeling like they're getting low salaries. That is very harmful for competitiveness because that means that people have to the businesses are incurring higher costs, which makes them less competitive relative to the other nationally. And then the local people who work is tend to either think that they're getting gypped or they don't want to take a job at all because it's just not worth it for them, right? And so this is a big issue. And when you talk to employers, attracting qualified human capital is the number one on their list. Labor costs are the number one thing on their list, right? And so a lot of these issues are caused by cost of living issues, right? Because if we just paid the 11th highest salary in the country, but we had a cost of living equal to the rest of the country, then we would be offering high salaries. And the number of workers would feel entitled or like feel a little bit better than that, right? So this is an important point. And so one of the traditional approaches that we've been doing for the last 40 years is trying to boost income and ignoring the cost of goods sold, right? So what do? We increase the minimum wage. That's good, but that also increases business costs, which lead to higher prices. We do targeted subsidies, right? So we say certain people can um, have a higher income, but that money has to come from somewhere, and it drives up the cost base. We mandate fringe benefits, right? So it's great that we have insurance. We mandate that all employers have to offer insurance. We have one of the most generous unemployment insurance in the country, but those are costs that are imposed on the employer, right? And so that ultimately drives up the cost of goods sold. And so an alternative approach to this is you should never ignore the income piece, but you also have to take into account the cost of goods piece, cost of living piece. And this is just to show you the Alice, right? So I hope most of you guys are aware of this income segment. It gets a lot of press and a lot of cachet at the legislature. These are ALICE households, which stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. These are working class families that are struggling to make ends meet, essentially. And what you'll see in the right-hand side, this is put out by the Aloha United Way. They've done it for a number of years. And what you'll see is about 29% of our families are ALICE households and another 12% in poverty at the poverty level. So that means 40%, almost half of our ALICE families are either ALICE or at the poverty line. So what they do with this ALICE households, and see, this is why being an economist is really important, right? Because you want to understand how they're doing the calculation, because how they do the calculation, how they do the analysis will influence your policy remedies, right? So oftentimes we think, oh, ALICE families aren't getting enough. We have to give more to ALICE families. But if you look at how they calculate the ALICE households, they take a certain amount of they come up with a giving basket of goods like food, rent, cell phone, all these things. They add them all up and they figure out what you need, right? So what's driving this is the cost. There's two options. You can either drive as like maybe the incomes are coming down, or maybe this cost of the basket of the cost of goods that Aloha United Way considers to be a minimum to live is going up disproportionately. And I wanted to show you. So here is the survival budget, which is what the Alice survey or Alice qualification is based upon. So in 2015, it was 72,000, but in 22 it was 107,000, right? So what you see is this is the percentage change in the gold for the budget, and this is the normal CPI. So the cost of goods, the essential cost of goods that people need to make ends meet is going up much faster than inflation and also going up much faster than wages. So we've been really focusing, and it's always important to focus on income. We don't want to like ignore that. But the other side of this is the cost of living, right? And if one of the frustrating things about living in Hawaii, but also living in many of the economic generators of the United States, is the things that most people consider are essential for their lives, housing, education, healthcare, are going up much faster than the rest of than their paychecks and everything. So flat screen TV, cheap, right? Everybody has a flat screen TV. When, most of us were here when flat screen TVs were like a luxury good, a sign of wealth. And so one of the big things is like, how do we address these issues? So I'm going to make you take Econ 101 really quick and indulge you, or you'll have to indulge me, because as a teacher, I think this is a very important insight into how this works. So hopefully most of you will recognize this supply and demand curve, right? So the demand curve, this is a normal supply and demand curve. This is the demand. So this is saying as things get more expensive, people demand less of it, right? So you can think of like, you know, if ice cream if ice cream were 50 cents, yeah, I'll have a bunch of ice cream cones, right? But if an ice cream cone was $100, there very few people would buy one. Eventually, I mean, ice cream's delicious, so some people would pay $100 for it for a once in a lifetime treat, but it wouldn't be happening all the time. The the other the other aspect of it is the supply curve, right? Hold on. The supply curve. And this is the idea that like as things get more expensive, people are going to produce more. So, and this applies to most goods. So like one, for example, you can think of like apples. Everybody like spends $2 or $3 for an apple, but and we have a certain amount of growers. No, let's use strawberries because like it's easier to like plant strawberries really quickly. Strawberries are nice. They cost a certain amount of money, right? But if suddenly all people are offering $100 for every basket of strawberries, you can be sure a bunch of farmers would jump on that train, and within 1 year, we'd have way more strawberries, right? So this is the idea that as the price increases, goods increase, right? And so the point here is when there's a big increase in demand, what happens is you usually get the suppliers come in and you go from this quantity to this quantity. So it's very easy for them to produce more, and the price goes up just a little bit, right? But this is a different case. This is called inelastic supply. This means that this means the supply curve is very vertical. And this means that even if things get more expensive, the market has no ability to provide more. And so what you see here is this is the same change in demand, right? But you get very little quantity increase and you get a huge price increase. So a lot of what happens in Hawaii is we have an inelastic supply of things. So you can think of this, the prime case is housing. Housing is not even curved like this, it goes straight up and down. So housing has gotten more expensive, but we have produced the lowest amount of housing units in the history of Hawaii have been produced in the last 2 or 3 decades, 2 decades, even though housing prices have gone up, right? So you got a lot more people wanting housing, but we don't like demand is increasing, but we're not producing anything more. So you get huge increases in prices, right? This is not only true for housing, we do a lot of this in Hawaii. Think about like if you want a new restaurant, it takes years to open a restaurant here in Hawaii because of our slow permitting process. And so even if we wanted more, like let's say we wanted more Thai food, it takes a long time for people to produce. Like say in a bunch of wonderful Thailees or Thai families have come and they want to give us more Thai food. It takes a long time for them to do that because we produce all these regulatory barriers. In the meantime, we have high prices, right? So the reason why I point this out is in economics we say this the elasticity of supply, but supply is a major driver of our economic welfare and economic outlook. And if we can do things that allow the market to be able to adjust their supply nimbly and at lower cost, this is going to be a huge impact on the way we think about things. It will lower the cost of living. So you could think of this, the basket of goods, the survival budget will suddenly, for Alice households, will suddenly go down if we could allow the market and different producers to produce the way we want. The difference is we don't do this. We take the opposite approach, right? So when things get really bad with housing and prices go up a lot, the first thing we do is we try to restrict demand, which slows down supply. So what do we do? In housing, we have zoning and land use restrictions, right? So we basically make it illegal to build new housing. We have permitting delays. Only 4% of our, at least in Oahu, is zoned urban for housing, right? So we limit the supply, which makes it more elastic, right? We're going from a relatively flat supply curve to almost horizontal or vertical. And then we juice up the demand, right? So we provide housing vouchers. We do more inclusionary zoning, right? So we're limiting the what suppliers the the profit that suppliers can get from offering new buildings. We do like, and this isn't just for Hawaii policies, but we do the mortgage interest rate deduction, so it makes it cheaper. We had lower interest rates, which really drove up the cost of housing, and we have a desire for larger units, right? And we have higher incomes, and so one of the problems is Hawaii's gotten richer, relatively speaking, because we're earning more, but we don't supply any more housing. And so that's just going to drive up housing. And so as we become richer as a society, remember, we're one of the richest, we are the richest uh, island chain in the whole country, in the world. But if we restrict building, if we restrict the provision of supplies, restaurants, different basic things, and make it hard for local companies or companies to provide these things, we're going to see a huge increase in price. And let this be clear. Most of this is manufactured scarcity. We have the technology and the know-how to produce more housing, densely populated housing. We have the knowledge, and uh, it's totally possible to have quicker permitting reform or permitting processes with. It's not a technological mystery. We don't need a Nobel Prize uh, winning thinker to think like come up with answers to these problems. The problems are known. What's hard thing about this is collective action problems, how we all get together and choose the future we want as if together. So a lot of discussion in Hawaii is like what industry, how are we going to diversify, and how are we going to think about have more growth going forward. So I want to start off with one, thinking about this problem or thinking about a different problem. So let's say you had to come up with, your job was to get a perfect flower and a perfect flower bed with the most amazing blooms. There's two ways to do that. One, you could scour the forest and find the perfect seed using all the information that you know about how a seed works. And then you could put all your energy in one seed, right? And you can plant it, you can like remove all the weeds, you can do everything, and you can make it perfect. The other way you could do it is you could actually throw out lots of seeds. You can like make sure the soil is fertile. You can make sure they have a healthy biome. And then as certain plants come up, like lots of the seeds won't ever germinate, right? Because that's the nature of seeds. And you can even prune for the most successful plants and let it grow. And you can encourage competition, right? So most people who are gardeners will know that like the approach on the right, creating conditions for growth, is a way better approach to farming and creating great flowers, right? Than on the left. In fact, you never even, when looking at a seed, you can never even really tell what's going to happen to the plant. But, and this is equally true for economics, but that's not how we do things here in Hawaii. In Hawaii, we're trying to pick some industry and we throw tons of money at that industry until it blooms, right? So one thing that we should be considering is rather than focusing on one industry and trying to throw tons of money at it and picking it ahead of time, It's way better to create an environment that allows 1,000 blooms to or flowers to bloom, and allow entrepreneurs and workers to take the risks and empower them, and they will discover the bright industries and how to diversify Hawaii's economy. And Hawaii has terrible soil, economic soil, and that's the issue, right? So this is a ranking of major costs that go into businesses, right? For a local business, high, small business, big business. But what you'll see is for overall business costs, Hawaii ranks the worst in the country. For wages, like I said, we have high wages, but really low value wages. So worker retention is very hard. We have our mandated fringe benefits are the most expensive. Our unemployment insurance is most expensive. And again, I'm not saying that these are wrong or right. I'm just saying that this is a reality for our businesses that we need to take into context, right? And so we could be 50th on one or two of these issues, but when we're 50th on every single issue in the country, that really harms our competitiveness. And so if you want new businesses to come in and try and explore and see what works, like whether it's like a fish farm on the Big Island or a new tourism idea, tourism consulting firm, you have to allow people to experiment and and have a profitable business. But you know, we our current system does not allow that. In fact, the only businesses that exist in Hawaii are basically businesses that have to be here, right? And so, like our permitting speed, that has nothing to do with our shared values as it's the low hostage state, but we're the worst in the country, right? We are we regulate businesses more than everybody else. Our taxation is one of the highest in the country. That's going to change a little bit with the big tax cut bill that I'll talk about in a little bit. And then there's issues with like rent and land cost. Again, we have some of the highest rents for businesses that compete with they're on par with New York, LA, and this is something we can deal with, right? We can always build more buildings if we want to. And like shipping and utilities, the shipping, some of these are going to be cost realities of life because we are the most we're the most isolated island chain in the country or in the world, right? But we have control over a lot of these aspects, right? And so one of the big things that I like to stress here is I don't really take an issue off of TMT, Super Ferry, Kahuku Wind Farm. But what I do point out is they were approved and then they were unapproved after a long period of decision making. And it's better for businesses if we just say no to them at the very beginning. So one of the big important things for Hawaii is they need to decide what they are willing to tolerate and how they go forward and then stick to it. Because what businesses want is a reliable environment. And then people can make decisions. So that's all kind of like negative Nancy stuff, right? But Hawaii has the legislature last year approved the largest tax cut in the country, or in its history, I'm sorry. And perhaps what I will argue is maybe we can build off of this, right? And so this is what the income tax burden for a family of four making the median Hawaiian household income of $97,000. And what this shows you is Hawaii has the second highest income burden. This means like if we did everybody's taxes in every single state with income tax, Hawaii would be the second highest. The only state that has a higher one is Oregon, and Oregon does not have any sales tax. We have the GET. So we probably had the highest income burden on all of our working families in the country. The legislature and the governor passed a bill last year that will go into effect over 8 years. And in 2031, when it's all said and done, we'll have the fourth lowest for working class families. Now, it will affect people with different incomes at different levels. People with higher incomes will have to pay more taxes, and they will not fall as low in the rankings as this. But they will fall somewhat, right? So like for household or people who make 200, 300,000, they'll probably be somewhere in the upper third. But that's really important, right? Because these are business owners. So think of somebody who owns an L&L or a successful L&L or McDonald's or something. They may, after years of work, they may be making $250,000, right? And so not having the highest tax burden in the country sends a signal to business owners that you can open up businesses and you can stay in Hawaii once you grow, right? And so, and also 90% of businesses in Hawaii are not corporations. They're structured as S corps or partnerships or sole proprietorships, which means that their taxes is paid on the individual income tax. So this is a tax cut not only on individuals but on businesses as well. So now I'm going to move into some. I'm wrapping up, and I know I've been talking for a long time, but I just thought I would toss out some like new ideas on how to think about improve labor participation and think about things. And one idea is occupation licenses. I don't know if you know this, but like a lot of professions require you to take a test, pass a board to go into the occupational licensing. It usually benefits people who are already there, but people who want to move into it, it hurts, right? And so Hawaii in the 1980s, our occupational licensing only covered 10% of our workforce, low income workforce, right? Because these generally apply to lower income workers. In 2025, it covers 60% of our workforce, right? Not only that, we require the most amount of schooling in the highest cost for those occupational licensing. Now, occupational licensing traditionally is we want people to be qualified when they do work because they can cause harms. So you want your brain surgeon to go through lots of schooling and pass the boards. But do you need an interior decorator to pass the licensing? Like, what's the worst thing that can come from that? You know, our landscapers, our hairstylists. So this is one way to think about this. Another way to do it is allow so some solutions might be use the lower occupational requirements, right? Reduce the amount of schooling, reduce how much it costs so people can enter into new professions and move across the labor force when they want to move from one place to another. Another is to recognize the occupational licenses from other states. And why we often don't do that. Even if you work in another state, you want to move here, you have to retake that exam and it takes a while. Another thing that we've been working on here in my office, and this is like in the initial research, but I think it's important, is I don't know if any of you guys have heard about the benefits cliffs. So this is the idea that we offer a lot of social services to our families in need, which is really important. But as they earn more, we take those benefits away. And sometimes we take the benefits away faster or just as fast as they make more money. So I'm on this business revitalization task force, and one of the common complaints about businesses is they say they want their workers to work more, but their workers say, no, we don't want to work more because we're afraid of losing benefits. And so this is a analysis by the Atlanta Fed, and it basically shows how much additional, like the increase in income you do from earning more when all things are taken in consideration. And what you see is from about, I don't know, 30,000 to 70, like almost 70,000, you don't get more money, or your consumption basket does not increase by earning more, right? And so one of the things that we may have to think about in the state is, I'm not arguing to take away for social services, but restructure the social services to incentivize work, right? Because again, this is very preliminary, but what this shows to me is it shows once you get into all these benefits, it's almost impossible to get out, because if you're going to earn more, you're going to lose a lot of things that are very valuable to your family. Most of this stuff the loss comes from housing vouchers, because particularly in Hawaii, because housing vouchers tend to be more generous than the rest of the United States because of our high cost of living. It means that if you lose those housing vouchers are worth a lot of money, and if you lose that by working more or taking on, that's a big blow to your style of living. So what we want to make sure is we want to empower people, give people the social safety net so they can take chances and improve their lot in life. What we don't want to do is create systems where say, oh, you can earn more, but then we're going to take away the things that you need. Another idea for improving our labor force participation is subsidizing childcare, particularly for women. This is one of the most important things, that oftentimes childcare costs way more than what they would do through earnings. So that's another opportunity. So I'm going to finish up here, but one of the things I wanted to stress is we should focus on increasing incomes, but cost of living issues also matter, right? And we should look at measures that boost the elasticity of supply. We should empower our local entrepreneurs, our local workers to supply the goods that we demand here as a state. Focus on broad-based reform, right? Rather than thinking about the next industry that's going to save Hawaii, that's going to move us away from tourism. Why don't we create an environment where we allow all the entrepreneurs to compete and they figure out what is the next industry? I think we can if we want to. There's already a recognition that the efforts of the last 40 years have not really yielded the economic results that we've wanted. People are interested in trying new things. The tax cut was one of those things, and I think we can build on those going forward. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to empower people. We don't want to discourage work. We want to empower a local labor force and our local entrepreneurs. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Thank you very much, Seth. Wow, you've given us a lot to think about. And I'm going to leave the questions to some of the folks in the room, but I did want to maybe ask you about the values, because I think in our preliminary discussions, you very much focus on the fact that these difficult decisions are related to the values that we hold dear. Do you want to
Yeah,
expound on that, please?
thanks. That's really important, right? So I always say values are important. Values are things you pay for. So if we want to take care of our workforce and have a high insurance rate, we should do that, but we should acknowledge that. But then we have to make decisions based on take that into consideration, and then use that information to make other decisions, right? So if we're going to have a high insurance rate, then we have to do other things for businesses so they can compete. Likewise, like our environment, we should really take care of our environment. If one of the values is our environment, we should. Or maybe we don't want to have any more growth. If that's a value of Hawaii and that's something we're willing to pay for, that's fine. But then we have to we have to accept the fact that we're going to have high housing and low economic growth, right? And so one of the things is that, like, values are really important for articulating, but the other thing that we have to do with housing, our values, is there are trade-offs to embracing certain values, right? And we should be explicit about the cost of our values, so we can say, yes, this is important, I want to keep them, and these are things I want to pay for, and then we can act and do things in other ways.
Thank you, Seth. Questions, anyone?
This is Leah. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Go
Hi, Leah.
ahead.
Hi. Okay, so you might have answered this at the end of your presentation, but I remember earlier on you were saying that Hawaii has what, the 30th, a really low work participation rate. And I was going to ask you the reasons why when cost of living is so high. Do you attribute that solely to fear of loss of that benefits cliff, or are there other reasons that you see for that low work participation rate?
Yeah, great question. So one thing is, I don't know for sure, and this is like research we're looking into. One aspect of it is if we do have a higher retired population, right? And so they're less likely to work. And so like the the people who are deciding to live here are less likely to be part of the active workforce, which is another contributing factor.
And that's a newer phenomenon as opposed to 20, 30 years ago?
Right. So because we don't have a lot of migration, which is tend to be young people, and our older population tends to stay here, it is like it's aggravating that the long-term effects, right? So like the older people stay, they retire, they're not going anywhere, but their young population either is moving away, and we're not having a replacement there.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? You might have to speak up because it's hard for me to see with more than 60 of you folks.
And this is Dion. Seth, you mentioned about the no, maybe I wrongly connected it, but about the current administration accelerating. Like the word came to my mind was the demise, but that's not what you said at all. I think you said like deficit spending, or maybe even different words from that. But I guess my question is in terms of like Hawaii's reliance, like you kind of tied it to Senator Inouye was good at bringing in federal funds to augment, monies here. And just like, it's like the tearing of the social safety net, like, I'm just wondering how soon in your like crystal ball could you kind of see that hitting the ground here?
Yeah, I think this is not, I work closely with the budgetary process, so I'm a little aware of what's going on. I think there's going to be two phases. One is there's three phases. One is we all became very, there was a lot of COVID funding that sloshed around the states. And this wasn't just why this is everywhere. We're still very reliant on them, right? And so you'll talk about one thing the Trump administration has done is they said, we're going to stop all COVID affiliated funding. And that was funding positions for not COVID things. So that was they're accelerating that, but that was going to go out of the system anyway. The other issue is this year they're going to pass a budget and there will be Medicaid spending, which is probably the most important aspect to this, right? And so it is not clear to me and it's not clear to anybody how big of the Medicaid cuts will be, right? And one of the big decisions for the state is, okay, if they put a work restriction on Medicaid, which is one of the proposals, is that something that they can live with, or do they want to cover the difference? If they want to, some of the most extreme versions were like massive big cuts in Medicaid. That doesn't seem to be happening now, right? So this year, I think there will be a budget case and there will be a retrenchment. One thing I try to keep in mind is like Trump tends to put a lot of our feelings into overdrive. So this is also something that you would expect from a traditional Republican administration is reduce the amount of federal spending to the states. The degree that they're going to do that is something that Hawaii could probably handle, but they have to decide, are they going to cover it themselves? In which case we're going to need a new revenue source, or are you going to move funding around? And then in the longer term, I think is this fiscal reckoning that's going to happen. And that's totally unclear how that will play out. That could be higher taxes at the federal level, or most likely it will be a mix of federal funding and a cut in benefits, right? Because if you look at our federal funding, most of what's driving it is our social safety net, right? So that's Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are the three biggest drivers of things. And how we deal with that as a nation and as Hawaii is something that I'm not sure will happen, but I think it's really important to have detailed conversations about it. And one of the things I argue for is let's have analysis, right? So one of the things I put out there is like, okay, if they cut Medicaid funding, we do have, because of we have one of the highest insured rate in the country, or we have the highest insurance rate. Maybe that'll affect us less, right? But we need to do these studies and really think things through so we can have intelligent conversations about how we should respond. And then this is where our values comes from, right? If this is the value that we want to take care of this certain portion of the population, let's know how much it costs, and then we can decide if that's what we want to do.
So Seth, if I may have a follow-up question to the fact that you were saying about how the federal monies are going away. Does the state have capacity to make up the difference? What about the rainy day fund?
Right. So the rainy day fund is usually meant to take up like bad economic times. If Medicaid spending, if that is ongoing and not just for 1 or 2 years, but over the longer term, that's something that the state will have to think about, make up for it in terms of longer term spending or longer term revenue decisions, right? So the way I think about it is our rainy day fund is for like, you know, if we enter in a recession because of the decisions made at the at the federal level by the president for next year or two, rainy days fund is totally legit. We should be using it then, right? But if there's a permanent and sustained cut to our spending and we don't expect that anymore, how we're going to pay for that is something that we would have to figure out.
How much is it the rainy day fund right now?
Something like 1.5 billion.
Billion.
Yeah, 1.5, 2 billion. About 10% of our general fund spending is there. So it's healthy, not the healthiest in the country, but most people think it's in a good spot. So we can definitely handle a dip. That is not, it won't cause a crisis. But that has to be like temporary.
Right. And only in dire straits like a recession, as you
Yeah.
were mentioning.
Mhm.
Okay, any other questions? Because I'm sure there's questions about diversification, because that was like a bomb that you dropped there.
Yes, I had a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Dana DeSoto. I am a work-based learning coordinator at Vibrant Hawaii, and I want to thank the WDC, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Seth, for your time. I appreciate the convening. So similar to diversification, I have probably some really unfair questions to ask, but I'd like to ask them anyway. You mentioned that there's this basket sort of that we're all kind of looking at, and there's many indicators, especially in terms of policy, the policy environment. So comparatively speaking, I'm wondering, has there ever been an instance that you are aware of where a similar economy to ours that is primarily service-based, hospitality-based, and I think the way that you put it best was the only businesses are here are the ones that have to be here. And so government provides a huge chunk of our employment for the workforce. Are there any examples where economies like ours with a similar history, and I'm thinking of places like the Bahamas and the Caribbean, maybe Puerto Rico is what I can come up with, but have you ever seen an instance where trends have been such for this period of time and an economy was able to kind of pull itself out of that and diversify and refocus? And what I'm kind of wondering about is technology seems to be an equalizer. I know most of the time that's relevant to manufacturing economies where technology and automation can help reduce costs of sorts. But I'm thinking about technology primarily in terms of taking advantage of the fact that, you know, the internet works here as it does, almost as well as it does in most places. So maybe we should be focusing on a reorientation and policy decisions that kind of create a more friendly environment for the remote workforce.
Great question. So there are plenty of examples of small island economies turning around and diversifying. Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, many, they tend to be a lot poorer. Like you got to think Hawaii is very different from all those countries, right? Because we're not that different from it. We're part of the United States, which is the richest, largest economy in the world. So we're what we economists call a frontier economy, which is like you can't copycat your way to something new as easily, right? You have to either invent or take something new. So to your point is like this knowledge-based economy and having people digitally participate things does work. Hawaii, one of the things that I didn't mention, but is kind of hard for Hawaii is our time zone. So we don't like London has the world's most perfect time zone because it has Asia and all of North America, right? But we don't really have Japan, even though that like in East Asia, which we are very culturally aligned with, and we get part of the Pacific, part of the Pacific time zone, right? And so that is a big issue in terms of like just having headquarters and workers here, is that type of things matter, but we should, right? And like getting to my point is allowing businesses to figure it out for themselves and discover is what I think probably the best case. And then you don't have to figure out which business, which sector is like the right one. You just support, you provide broad-based support for all of them. And that means, making it easy to, if they do need a small manufacturing plant or a small 3D manufacturing plant, allowing them to do that, right? Within a reasonable period of time versus the 5 to 6 years that it can often take for people who want to do something new.
Other questions?
Hi, this is Joy. I have a question. This is regarding when you were speaking about regulations and licensing requirements for businesses. It's my understanding that a long time ago, when they were putting these requirements in place, it was with the understanding that it would protect local businesses. What I mean by that is it would be harder for companies or individuals from the mainland to come up and compete right off the bat with the local businesses. That's why they had these requirements in place. So if we were to take away those requirements, the licensing requirements, or those protections, how do you think it would impact local business?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is one of the really important things that we have to consider, right? So shielding yourself from competition works for a little while if you have a plan for how you're going to compete again. So, like, if you're worried about mainland firms out competing local firms, like you can put up these like a barrier to entry, like a hard like occupational license, but eventually you have to support the things, your local businesses, so they can eventually compete, right? And in terms of economic growth, this is really important because the competition actually helps businesses behave better and better and better. And so this is one of the things I think Hawaii really has to decide for itself and how it wants to deal with things is oftentimes we try to protect ourselves from mainland competition. And that probably works in the short term, but over the long term, we have declining levels of income and growth because we become less competitive, even more less competitive relative to the mainland. One of the big decisions that Hawaii needs to decide is, do you want to stay protected and have relatively stagnant levels of growth, or do you want to expose yourself, or at least have a plan, an informed plan for exposing yourself to more competition so you can help your business, ensure that your business compete on a national level? So that's a great question, Joy, and that's something that people have to decide for themselves. I think over the short term, it does work out, but over the long term, we're seeing the effects of that.
Great discussion. Any other questions? Cheryl.
Aloha. Thank you so much, Panette. And thank you, Seth, for a great presentation. Your first or second slide showed that the federal government was bringing in a good deal of money. I'm fairly focused on the defense side, and I know that the DoD is a big presence in Hawaii. Have you and your team, and I think the Hawaii Defense Alliance has kind of pushed this through, just numbers wise, but I don't know if there's new stats. There's something called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which has poured more and more money into this area of responsibility, us being the headquarters for the entire region, the largest AOR for the military. I'm curious if you and your team have good statistics on how that money might trickle down into our economy. Aside from, it just feels like all these millions of dollars are coming into the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, but where do we see it? Where do we see it on the ground, more or less? Is this mostly just military-run programs, or is it money received? Because they're really set salary-wise. The GS contractors are set, or the GS people are set. The contractors are set. How do we see big pumps of money influence our state economy?
Yeah, so I've looked at those numbers. My numbers are a little stale, to be perfectly honest. So I don't have updated numbers for you, but I'll tell you how I think about how they support the local economy. One is 1 out of 9 people living in Hawaii is either active military or related to active military. Those people spend money. I mean, you could argue they compete with our housing, but they also they live among us, and that is one reason why we for our GET revenue, and it really bolsters consumption, right? And that does flow through in a big way. So I think it's mostly the military personnel and different people spending their money that they've made, that the DoD pays them somehow. It is not a source of innovation, right? So like we can kind of think of like two aspects of our economic pie. One is consumption, and the other is these kind of like really innovative investments where you grow the businesses and you create these innovative firms. So the big name right now is Palantir or something like that. We just don't have those here. I know there's been a lot of interest in cultivating that, but like the way that the military contracting goes, it's all through Washington, right? So it doesn't have like the fact that we have so many active military personnel living here is not an added value for like a defense industry or something like that. I grew up in San Diego, so like it's like another military town with like, but they're very good at getting defense contracting and stuff, and that's mainly because they have like a whole sector in universities and stuff dedicated to that. That's something that Hawaii could do, but it's like competing against some already well-established things. I'll finish, but one thing that I will say, what you alluded to is will goes against what I also had to say about this. The contraction in federal funding, I think, will affect like certain projects and stuff. But because we have active military here, and a lot of the strategic priorities of the United States are shifting to the Pacific Alliance. I really think that that is actually a selling point for Hawaii in terms of just like maybe it's not growth, but it's stability. And the military, when we had no tourists during COVID, the military was still here. When we like, it's very recession-proof uh, economy for us, and especially because it doesn't really count as much on defense contracting as it does as like just military personnel. It has been relatively steady here in Hawaii, and that's something that we should expect going forward, and it will help moderate our fluctuations.
Thank you, Dr. Colby.
Any other questions?
I have another one unless somebody else wants to go because I already asked.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so throughout this presentation, which I very much appreciate, being someone who's, born and raised here, the questions pop into my mind, and I hope this isn't unfair, about, well, what about our environment? What about our limited island resources? What about our cultural identity? How do we make that all work together without losing the things that make us who we are? I don't know if I'm asking my question right.
No, I think that's a great question. I think that is
Yeah.
the question, right? Which is we have our values, we have our identities, and we want to protect them, but we also want to promote those in a way that still allows us to take actions and decide our future that we want. So
Yeah.
there's this big conversation going on, not just in Hawaii, but all over the United States about this agenda. Like a lot of the laws that were passed in our constitutional convention, passed in the 1970s when we were having huge environmental crisis, much bigger than what we're doing now. And a lot of large swaths of the population were excluded from the democratic process. Now we're to the point where anybody can show up at a town hall and really stop the process, and like litigation is environmental laws. Even people who are not having environmental aims are using environmental laws to use litigation to slow down decisions that big, this is the different parts of the government have democratically decided to do. So a big part of this is not saying, oh, this is either environment or growth. This is like, how can we have both, and how can we have a decision-making process that's a little bit more efficient, where we get to make decisions, we get to deliberate, but once we do that, we get to move forward, right? And that is a process that is a big question for a lot of places in the United States, and I think it is really important for Hawaii. It's like, okay, if you really want to do, I'm not saying the rail was a great idea, but if you wanted to do the rail, could you do it? It would have been way cheaper if we could have done it in 6 years versus 14. And a lot of the 14 was based on like a lot of these processes and veto points and people stepping into the society after, the people had voted on it, right? And so this is the big question, is how can we start in the housing? Everybody says they want more housing here in Hawaii, but nobody wants more housing in their neighborhood, right? And I can understand, because nobody wants more parking, or like people taking away their parking. That's why I say these are collective action problems more than technical problems, right? Because we know how to build more housing in Hawaii. We could even build more housing without even cutting down one more tree in Hawaii. We could, if that's what we wanted, but we're making these decisions. So like a big part of this is like, how can we have insurance, like processes that empower people, empower local entrepreneurs, while making decisions and having a value, and ensuring that we are guarding our cultural and environmental heritage at the same time.
Great conversation.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Last question, maybe if you can just elaborate on the business revitalization committee that you're part of, the task force, and what do we expect from that? And I know there's forthcoming results or outcomes that will be revealed at some point.
Yeah, so what's interesting is being on a business revival. Like, I work for the state, so I go back, and I'm an economist, so I go back and reread reports all the time. And these reports have been coming up over and over again, and they always say the same thing since the 1990s, right? It's like, oh, burdensome regulation, all these things hurt the economy. So going back to the previous question, is one thing that I think the Business Revitalization Task Force is starting to come to terms with is like, why do we still make these decisions? That we say, like, why are we still having this conversation 40 years later? It's something about a process more than a specific policy, or like, oh, if we just invested in this area, or if we just cut this one regulation, all of our problems will be solved. So I think it's much more of a bigger question of like, how can we create a system that rewards accountability versus just checking the boxes? And the checking the boxes, I work in government, I'm super guilty of, I get paid nobody can fire me if I check the right boxes. I can be fired if I like take a little bit of initiative and do things, right? And so we're trying to, again, not get rid of all those safeguards, but really move things in a different direction. And one thing is, this is something we're just going along in the business revitalization task force, but I think maybe we need to like make a commitment as a state to be a little bit more business friendly, right? To move up in the rankings. Like, I'm not saying we should be number one, because I don't think that will work, but maybe middle of the road. And like, we don't know how we're going to get there, because like, you can't decide. These are things that are iterative processes that you make things go forward. And we do that with the caveat that certain values are being preserved, right?
Again, great conversation, food for thought that I think people will carry, and hopefully as you're going around about your business, you can mull over these things. And at the end of the day, I think what you were saying is, it'll take collective will to make changes. Hopefully, Workforce Development Council will be part of that conversation, or will continue to be part of that conversation. Folks, just to let you know, Dr. Colby has already sent me his slide deck. We're going to be sending that to the folks who are in this room, and maybe, and also a recording of this will be available on our website. Saying that, we want to thank again Seth Colby for his very insightful discussion of our economy, the trends that we have. And I want to thank him for, I think, boldness and courage in a lot of these things that needed to be said. So thank you everyone for being here and for being part of this conversation. Aloha. Mahalo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.